slide. May 17, 2018, Ken Kaufman posted this meme on Facebook about the first big day ever in birder history. And I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. And then I read that they searched for birds from Oberlin up to Lake Erie shoreline and brought it back. And I was like, Oberlin, why? I never knew this story. I don't know who these people are. Let me Google them and find the book, and I'll read about them. And there wasn't a book. And so I just followed my curiosity, and I said, I really want to know what they wrote in their diary about that day. What did they do? How did they do it? What species did they see? And so I went, try to speak up or get closer to the mic. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I went to the Oberlin College archives and I said, can you point me to anything that has to do with Lynds Jones? And there's like a room full of material. It's prolific. But I did find the notebook in which he actually wrote down, and I'll show it to you later, the story, the very brief story of that day. And the more I learned about Lynds Jones, the more I felt like we had in common. We sang in the same choir, we went to the same church, we birded in the same places, we were both obsessed with migration, especially warblers. And I just recently learned, now this is 7 years into this obsession, that we both had ancestors on the Mayflower, so they probably knew each other back then. So I feel like Lynds and I would have been friends or family members. We're born nearly a century apart, but lived kind of parallel lives. He was quite an interesting person, and the more I learned, the more I was astounded at the importance of everything that he did in his life to ornithology and birding and ecology. So one of the first things I learned about him is that he was the first person to teach a college-level course in ornithology. That was at Oberlin College. He founded the Wilson Ornithological Society, which is still active today. He also helped start the Wilson Journal of Ornithology, which is published today. And he co-wrote one of the early books about the birds of Ohio in 1903, which was not a field guide, it was a big 2-volume set of like 600 pages of all the birds. It was still a really fascinating read. He also left a really important legacy to recreational birding. Birding essentially didn't exist in the 19th century. He was one of the first people to actually want to observe birds in nature rather than just collect them. He did the first big day, as I mentioned already. He also did the first Christmas bird count, which is a story that is really lost to history. And he might have been the first lister. You know how we all keep, well, I don't know, everyone does this. I do this. We keep lists of the birds that we see wherever we go and just send them to eBird. I'm an obsessive lister. He was an obsessive lister back before there were any electronics. He just wrote everything down and then published it in his journal. He also was a pioneer in ecology. He had the first ecology department at Oberlin College. He led some of the first ecology field trips, which I'm going to tell you about at the end, these massive trips to the West Coast. And he was a mentor to many women in ecology. I'll start with ornithology. So Lynds was born in Ashtabula, but he was born in 1865, and his father was in the militia, but his wife, Lynds' mother, wouldn't let him go to fight in the Civil War. You can't leave me home with all these young children. You must stay and help me out. And he was sort of embarrassed when the Civil War ended and all of his comrades came home or didn't. And so he took his family and moved out to Grinnell, Iowa, and that's essentially where Lynds grew up. When he was young, a neighbor taught him how to collect bird eggs, which you could sell for money. Back then, you can't collect bird eggs now, you need a permit. But it was fairly lucrative, and the family needed money. Their father was not a super wonderful farm manager, so that the kids were farmed out to do money-making chores. But Lynds got really obsessed with this collecting of eggs, and by the time he was 25 and he left Grinnell, he had assembled a collection of 250 species of bird eggs. Not all of these he collected himself, but he traded ones that he collected for birds from other parts of the country that would mail these eggs back and forth. Wow. And if you think about what you have to know in order to be able to collect bird eggs, you have to be an incredibly astute observer of nature and spend a lot of time outdoors. I've gone hunting for nests of various species, and like hooded warbler. I was doing a breeding bird survey, and I could hear the hooded warblers singing in the woods, and I never found a nest. I'm quite sure Lynds would have found the nest and collected the eggs. Wow. So while he was still, I think, quite a young man, he was sending his observations of bird migration to the U.S. Geological Survey, so he was one of the first early providers of data on bird migration. In 1875, there was a club, a nationwide club started in the name of Louis Agassiz, who was an early natural historian who held some kind of controversial views, including he was very anti-evolution. He believed that God created nature and that the way to find God was through careful study of nature. So this club was founded in his honor. It wasn't, I don't think he was alive at the time, but they formed these chapters all around the country, and in Grinnell, one of Lynds' teachers, George Tallman, founded a club, the Grinnell Chapter 887, and it was mostly young people. So Lynds was in his early 20s, and his brothers and George Tallman's children and some of the other neighbor kids came together, and they had this little club. They produced their own newspaper, which I was so excited when I found this in the archives. It's like tabloid size, handwritten, hand illustrated. I don't know how many copies they produced, but it was many pages. Wow. And I believe I read somewhere, and I can't remember where, that Clara Tallman was the illustrator of at least some of these beautiful drawings, and she was George Tallman's daughter and married Lynds Jones. They also had a natural history museum, and Lynds was the curator. So here is the first issue of the Grinnell Agassiz Notes that I found Lynds Jones listed as any kind of editor. So he's the managing editor of this issue. And pretty much for the rest of his life, he was an editor of a journal of some sort or another. So as I said, the Agassiz Association was organized geographically. They held state conferences. They published a journal for a couple of years called the Swiss Cross. So this is an entry from Club 887 in one of the Swiss Cross journals. And it's basically, this is what our club did. And we had a birthday party for Louis Agassiz, and we enjoyed our study of nature of various kinds. And he encourages everyone to write notes on their observations and publish scientific papers. We advise all AA members to follow this practice, and you'll see why this is important. In 1888, a group of people who were interested in ornithology, largely I guess these egg collectors, decided they wanted to form a chapter of the Agassiz Association that was interest-based rather than geographic in nature. And they started publishing their own journal, which the very first issue was the Ornithologist and Oologist Egg Collectors Semi-Annual. They renamed it the Wilson Ornithological Society in honor of Alexander Wilson, an early American ornithologist. And it's still published today as the Wilson Journal of Ornithology.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, pretty amazing. As you might imagine, at a club that doesn't have very many members, you have to wear a lot of hats. This is an issue of the Wilson Journal, or whatever it was called back then, Wilson Bulletin, from 1891. They had 15 members, of which 11 voted, and they elected Lynds Jones president with 9 votes. He also was the secretary, he tallied the votes, and he was also the acting treasurer. He wrote the introduction, the editor's note at the beginning of the journal, because by that time he was the president. And lo and behold, he also edited the journal.
Wow.
It's gotten a lot bigger now. But he was secretary, editor, president, and treasurer, some of those concurrently, for much of his life. Mostly editor, 36 years. All right, the story of how he came to Oberlin College. As I said, he was a student at Grinnell, or he was living in Grinnell. He started studying at Grinnell College, but they had a very classically oriented curriculum. Now, his mother's sister, Mary Burton, lived in Oberlin, and she was married to General Giles Shirtliff, who was then the treasurer of Oberlin College. She wrote to Lynds and said, I know you're very interested in studying natural history, why don't you come to Oberlin College? We have a much more science and natural history-oriented curriculum, you might like it here. And she offered to sponsor him. So indeed, he moved to Oberlin, took the train out here. He studied for 2 years and got his bachelor's degree and became curator, no surprise, of the college's Museum of Natural History, and he sent for Clara Tallman and married her in 1892, and she came out from Grinnell to Oberlin.
Oh, wow.
So in that year that he graduated, he didn't want to just be the curator. He said, hey, I'm really interested in birds. I know a lot about birds. I think people would be interested in birds. Can I teach a class? And the college was like, no one's gonna be, that's just not that interesting, so we're not gonna let you teach the class for a salary, but we'll let you collect a laboratory fee and you can enroll students. Well, to their chagrin, it became the most popular class at Oberlin College. It had as many as 150 students enrolled at a time. And I was rereading some of his journal entries this afternoon, and he wrote, took 42 girls out to the South Woods at 5:45 in the morning.
And he was 27.
Yeah. He studied at the University of Chicago, getting his PhD in zoology in 1905. At that point, he thought he might have to leave Oberlin College because he wanted to get a better job. And I'm going to tell you about what happened to that down the line. He ended up staying. But first I want to introduce you to Leon Dawson, who was one of his closest friends and partners in crime. They had many, many adventures together. They published a lot of papers together. They seemed to really have a good time. And Dawson said that Jones taught him how to listen and to birdsong. And as I said, Lynds Jones sang in a choir, so he was a musician. He listened to birdsong musically, and when he published papers describing new species that he'd seen, he would notate somewhat musically how they sounded in a way that was a lot easier for people to be able to kind of translate. Back then you didn't have recordings. You had to go by what somebody said the bird sounded like. Leon Dawson was a theologian, and he became a minister and took a parish out in Washington State, but he never stopped looking at birds, and eventually he gave up ministry for the study of birds, of ornithology. He was especially interested in eggs, and when he lived in Santa Barbara, he donated his collection to what became the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. So his egg collection was the basis for the founding of that entire museum. But when they went broader from than birds, he kind of picked up and left town. He's like, he was only interested in birds, so he didn't really want them to do natural history writ large. He wrote, as I mentioned, The Birds of Ohio, Birds of Washington, and Birds of California, twice. In 1900, the two of them took this epic journey west. They went by train. It took 2 months. By this time, Lynds' family, I think his brother and his sister were living in Pasadena. So he went to California while Leon Dawson went back to Washington State, and then they met up again. Lynds said he had the greatest number of species added to his life list in Los Angeles County. In Washington State, they crossed Lake Chelan by steamboat, hiked up in the mountains, and one day while they were hiking, their fire hadn't been completely put out, and it smoldered and caught and burned what was remaining at the campsite, his bedroll, extra clothes, return ticket home, specimens they collected. Also, they had been using arsenic to preserve bird skins, and that poisoned their remaining food. So they were literally up a creek without a paddle, and they got tired of hiking, and they built themselves a raft and floated down the Skagit River, portaging around rapids and waterfalls. When they got back to civilization and they tried to tell people their story, they were not believed. And altogether, they traveled through 14 states, 7,000 miles. Lynds obsessively kept track of every single mile he traveled in his entire life by whatever conveyance it was, by foot, by horseback, by canoe, by car, by train. He had a lifetime bird list and a lifetime mile list. They saw 309 species. And they wrote about it in the journal. Each of them had an article. Dawson wrote about the journey itself, and Jones wrote about all the birds they saw. And I recently came across this journal. Was found by the current professor of ornithology, or a biology professor, Professor of Botany at Oberlin College, in a storage room or closet, and he emailed me and said, I found some stuff, would you be interested? And I was like, yeah. So there were some letters, which were wonderful, and then I came across this journal, and I knew exactly what it was, because it's a 1900 Western trip. So he must have had this notebook in his pocket when they were hiking, because it didn't get destroyed in the fire, and this is his bird list from basically that week. One of those days is the one where they had the fire, and I haven't figured out exactly which one, but he just kept observing birds and writing it down. They collaborated on The Birds of Ohio. Dawson wrote most of the text, and Lynds Jones provided all of the things that we think of today as bird sightings, like Lake County piping plover, July 1st, 1903, went into the book. It's a very large, like I said, not a field guide, but I highly recommend if you ever want to read some really beautiful descriptions of birds. Now, keep in mind the birds are all the same as the ones that we see today, but they're described much more expansively and poetically in these in Dawson's words, and it's really you can find it online. Just go check it out. I highly recommend it. They dedicated the book to Will Oberlin Dawson, who was at the time, I guess, around 5 years old, already proving himself in a fond father's eyes as a young ornithologist, and he's filling some big shoes. Well, Will also went to Oberlin College, and in 1920, this is a precious letter that Lynds wrote to his wife, Clara, and I don't have very many of Lynds' letters because obviously they got sent to other people, but because these got sent to Clara, they are in the archives. And so this one from 1920, Clara was traveling on the West Coast, and Lynds wrote and said that Will Dawson has dropped the freshman Bible and come into my bird course, just like his dad. He said nothing to me about it until the deed was done, so I am not guilty. I don't know what his father will say. I guess that any lack of knowledge of the Bible on his part due to this change might well be laid to his father's door. And then he goes on to describe the farm chores that he's performing, because all of this time that he was teaching ornithology and curating the museum, he was also a farmer. The next Birds of Ohio wasn't published until 1989 by Bruce Peter Jones. Switching to recreational birding. How many of you have done a big day, gone to the biggest week, done a big year, known somebody who did any of those things?
That's a good one.
Yeah, so this is, he is the originator of this, he and Leon Dawson. So, back to the All Day with the Birds, May 17th, 1898. And in 1900, he became the first solo bird watcher to see 100 species in a single day, also in Lorraine County. I want to talk about how they did this, because they weren't driving, they didn't have cars. The optics weren't great. They didn't even ride a bicycle or go by horse. So this is from his journal, handwritten. Dawson and I went to S Woods, South Woods at 3:15 a.m., stayed till 7:30 a.m., came home to breakfast, took 8:30 car, reached Lorraine at 9:45, walked over to Oak Point on the beach part of the way, then home cross country. Reached home at 8:30, recorded 102 species of birds.
Wow. Wow.
I bird the South Woods now. They spent a lot of time walking around the woods, but there are owls there, which is probably why they went so early in the morning. So they spent about 4 hours walking around the South Woods. At minimum, that's 3 to 4 hours, 3 to 4 miles, probably more. Went home to breakfast, took the train, or whatever it was called, the interurban, to Elyria, changed for Lorraine, got off at basically Black River Landing, downtown Lorraine, and then they walked along the beach about 4 miles. And then here at Oak Point, there's a creek, Beaver Creek, that empties out into Lake Erie, and at the time there would have been shorebirds there. Now it's a marina and power plant and an auto manufacturing facility, so there's no shorebirds anymore. And then they walked through Beaver Creek as far as it goes, and it doesn't go all the way to Oberlin, and then cross country until they reached home. Home by 8:30, 102 species.
Wow.
That was May 17th, so 3 days ago. My family and I try to do a big day every year. I have 2 kids, they're 16 and 20 now, and we've done this for years, so they were pretty little when we started. And last year, I think we got to 97 species. we decided, okay, we can quit now because that'll give us something to shoot for next year. So we can't do our big day until next weekend, so I don't think we're going to get anywhere close to 100, but we're going to try. So now everyone does big days, big weeks, big years. The book, The Big Year, came out in 2004, and the movie in 2011. This is like a ritual for my family to regularly watch this movie. Christmas bird count. How many people think the Christmas bird count started in 1900?
Wow.
One, Becky. The story goes that it started in 1900, but I'm going to tell you that it didn't. December 28, 1897. Again, this is something that I dug out of his handwritten daily diary, which he kept pretty much his entire life. Recorded the weather, the temperature, the cloud cover. So in this entry, Dawson and I took the bird census of 2/3 of town within the 3/4 mile limit, 16 species and 74 individuals, about 10,000 English or house sparrows.
10,000. Wow.
I live right about there. I have never tried to bird all throughout the 3/4 mile limit of Oberlin. Don't think I would want to. I do the Christmas bird count, but it's 15-mile diameter circles now. In 1898, he published this in the Wilson Bulletin, described the weather, and then said it's just sharp enough to give zest to outdoor life without discomfort, just bright enough to give activity to the birds. What he was trying to do was to get people interested in watching, observing, learning about birds all year, not just when it was exciting when they were coming through in migration or nesting. Such little things as high picket and wire fences, thorny hedgerows, inquisitive housekeepers, and threatening incarceration as lunatics are not to be considered. The census taking will fill in the usual winter blank. And then he concludes with, try it. And he did it every year, and finally Frank Chapman in Bird Lore, National Audubon publication, picked it up, and he decided to make it more of a nationwide thing. Now there were only 27 sites spread throughout the country, very heavily East Coast focused. That Lynds Jones was one of the participants, and everyone sent in their bird list for the Christmas bird count for publication in Bird Lore in February. And the Christmas bird count has been run every year since. It's gotten bigger all the time. It's only in North and South America, but it's pretty much as far north in North America as you can get, and it's pretty much far south in South America and beyond. I actually think the Drake Passage is the furthest south there is a Christmas bird count. In 2024, 83,000 people participated in 2,600 count circles. They tallied about 1/4 of the world's bird species in total, and 43 million birds, which sounds like a lot until you realize it's half as many birds as they counted 50 years ago when there were half as many count circles and half as many observers. Sobering. So data from the Christmas bird count is now used to guide conservation because you can see trends, you can see movement of species, you can see correlate habitat restoration or destruction with the effects on various species. It's quite useful for conservation. It all started with curiosity and trying to do something interesting in winter and also not shoot birds, which was also the custom at Christmas time. Finally, I'm going to touch on ecology. I'm going to introduce you to Althea Sherman. Does anybody here know who Althea Sherman is or heard of her? She's famous for having built a chimney swift tower and to study the nesting cycle of chimney swifts. She was the first person ever to do this. She built a tower in her backyard and put windows in it and staircase around it so she could climb up and peer in. And she was the first person to document the nesting of chimney swifts, which we now use to build towers to promote chimney swift conservation. Normally they would have nested in hollow trees, but we cut all those down now, and so they moved to chimneys, but those a lot of times are capped, and so the way to try to preserve and restore the population of chimney swifts is by building wooden towers that attract them to nest. And only one pair of chimney swifts will nest in any one tower. She graduated from Oberlin College from 1875. Oberlin was one of the first colleges in the nation to admit women as students. She studied art and was an art teacher until her parents became ill and she had to move home to Iowa and take care of them until they died. And then she stayed in the homestead with her sister, who was a physician. She was fascinated by birds. She began studying the birds just at the homestead. And because Lynds was teaching ornithology at Oberlin College, she began corresponding with him. And I found in the archives, in the Jones family archives, a folder of letters from Althea Sherman to Lynds Jones that had not been documented by the archivist. And they have a whole collection of Althea Sherman material because she's a famous graduate, and they had done an exhibit on her in the library, and yet these letters were not known to anyone until I discovered them. She published her first article in the Wilson Bulletin in 1905, Some Observations at Weed Seed Inn, which is what she called her homestead. So in 1905, I said, Lynds got his PhD, and he was hoping to be hired away and get a more prestigious job somewhere. And he even sold his house to make it look to the college like he could pull up stakes and move at any time. And Althea was very concerned that this was going to happen, and she urged Oberlin College to endow a professorship in ornithology, and she provided $600 in seed money, and she lobbied the trustees, alumni, current students, even elected officials to try to get this endowment money. And unfortunately, she failed. But she wrote this letter to Lynds after she visited him in Oberlin around Christmas time in 1906. The important part of the letter is, I hope the subject connected with the welfare of Oberlin College, in which I have been deeply interested, is being satisfactorily settled. I have to try to do all I can according to the light afforded me. I have urged the matter upon trustees and alumni as I have met them. All agree with me as to what is best for Oberlin, and I think we shall secure her best interest if you can afford to wait. In April, I visited in Minnesota. In Northfield, I found all my friends were studying birds. This means that in a few years, our colleges will give more attention to the study, and Oberlin ought not to lose her leading position in the work being done in that line. Yours respectfully, Althea Sherman. So unfortunately, Oberlin did not raise, I don't know if they didn't try, didn't want to, but they were not able to raise money for the endowed professorship. So Sherman took her $600 and she paid it directly to Lynds Jones to supplement his salary so that he would be encouraged to stay at Oberlin to teach ornithology. And he had a disagreement with the chairman of the Department of Zoology, and he was given his own Department of Animal Ecology, which was the first of its kind anywhere in the country. Unfortunately, both the department and the classes in ornithology were dropped from the curriculum when he retired at the mandatory age of 65 in 1930. they could have stayed ahead of the game, but no. They do teach ornithology now, and they do have a curriculum in ecology, but it wasn't continuous. I wanted to share this paper that Althea wrote because I think it's emblematic of the kind of collaboration that she and Lynds Jones had, where he was encouraging her study and her knowledge of birds by letting her publish, or asking her to publish in a journal, and she was encouraging his career at the same time. I'm going to read this to you because at the time that Lynds first began studying birds, the goal was to try to classify birds. So taxonomy was the number one most important thing that you could do in the study of nature. And so they would collect specimens and do rigorous examination of feathers and morphology to try to decide how closely related certain species were and where to classify them in terms of family, genus. But Lynds was a lot more interested in the behavior of birds and the relationship to the natural world, which was not a study at the time. Right now, today, we just take it for granted. Of course, you study birds and what they do and how they behave and where they fly and how they nest. But that wasn't the state of knowledge or the pursuit of knowledge at the time. So this paper, Althea wanted to present at the American Ornithological Society conference, and she wrote to Lynds and sent it to him and said, "Do you think I should present this paper? Because I'm not a trained ornithologist. I don't really know what people already know about flickers, and is this going to be new knowledge?" And he said, "Of course it's new knowledge, and of course you should publish it, and I'll publish it in the journal too." And the studies upon which this paper is based were conducted at National, Iowa. And if we, down to the next paragraph, let's see. If we properly interpret the particular function of the Wilson Bulletin, this paper accurately typifies it. While there is a certain value to the detection of slight differences in the plumage of our North American birds from museum specimens, and perhaps the necessity for giving names to groups of individuals showing the differences, it remains for the careful student of the living birds to detect the causes for such variations. Of the two fields of study, it must be clear to all that the study of the living bird and its environment is much the more necessary. The Bulletin has consistently urged upon its readers the earnest pursuit of field studies and takes this opportunity to again urge it. We must know more about the living bird before we can expect to assign him his proper place in the world of taxonomy as well as the world of conservation in all of its aspects. Our imperfect knowledge makes any system of taxonomy admittedly tentative. If we read this paper aright, we will detect all along between the lines a devotion to the study in hand which spells an enormous amount of labor. Try it if you don't believe it. She built nest boxes in the side of her barn and then collected the nestlings on a daily basis and weighed them and put them back. And this is the obsessive documentation, the necessary documentation of all of the flicker families. This paper is like almost 40 pages long.
Wow.
And she did the illustrations as well.
Wow.
Now we get to perhaps the most fun part of the talk. I'm going to tell you about these summer ecology field trips that Lynds organized. Beginning in 1910, he took students to ecology summer school in Lake Erie, for 1 year at Point Pelee, another year at the OSU Lake Laboratory and at Marblehead. And beginning in 1915, he decided he was going to take college students on a 6-week field trip to the West Coast by train, which he did for 2 years, 1915, 1916. After World War I, he began doing these trips by car, which, as you might imagine, were a little bit difficult given the state of roads and the state of cars in 1919. What I found so interesting about looking at the journals of these field trips was that how many women participated in them. The archivist at the college told me about a photographic journal kept of the 1915 trip by Enid Bancroft Sutton, and she not only kept a photographic journal, but she had a handwritten paper that she submitted, I guess, for credit for the summer class. So maybe it's best if I just turn around here. They took the train to Seattle, which over here somewhere. And they took a ship around up through the Strait of San Juan de Fuca, making several stops, till they got to Neah Bay, where there's a Native American reservation. And then they boarded ocean-going canoes, guided by the Native Americans, and they visited coastal islands and studied the birds that were nesting on them. And they traveled not only by canoe, but also hiking and on horseback. They camped and fished along the way and ate. So they brought staples with them, but they supplemented their diet with whatever they could catch while they were fishing. Here, Enid is taking a picture of everyone as they were departing. You can see how many women are in here. It's like well over half.
Wow.
And that's a self-portrait. Can you guess who? Leaving Neah Bay by canoe. And then a picture of Professor Jones in the camp kitchen. That's a big log. And then a hard landing on one of the islands. The picture fails to show how rough it was.
Yeah.
And here are some of her photographs of the birds. I thought these were pretty amazing for 1915. This beautiful colony of California murres, ledge where they were nesting, close-ups of the California murres, climbing the cliffs to the murres ledge. And here's a captured tufted puffin, which I believe they probably just reached into the burrow and pulled them out because they weren't mist-emitting at all at that time.
Yeah.
This was the Kodak pocket folding camera that she would have been using. The next trip that I have a journal for was 1922. So they shifted from train travel to automobile because it made it a lot easier to decide where you wanted to go. They could go as they pleased to study different areas of the country. And the way they did this was they bought new cars in Ohio, 4 or 5 a year, drove them to the West Coast and sold them if they could, not always able to, took the train home. If they didn't sell the cars, they drove the cars home.
Wow.
This is the 1920 trip where they bought what they called a one-ton truck, a Ford one-ton truck, and they put all the luggage in that truck. This is Lynds' son George and his wife Clara. The one-ton truck was not a great idea. It was too heavy for the roads. It was too slow for the other cars, and they ditched that idea and just carried the luggage on the individual cars every time after that. And I should say also, George in his diaries or his write-ups of these trips said every year his father said, "I'm never going to do this again," in August when they got back. And then by February he's like, I gotta start planning the next trip.
Wow.
This is a photograph that was just recently sent to me from the 1921 trip. I love what they have written on the back. ecology trip,
I put on Facebook.
no future, but oh, what a past. College, summer school, Ohio, and Tacoma. Woohoo! Grace Cowan Berlin kept a diary of the 1922 summer ecology field trip. She was one of the first women in Ohio to receive a degree in ecology in 1923. In fact, I looked at the yearbook for that year, and there were three graduates of animal ecology that year, and they were all women. She became an ecologist, ornithologist, and historian in Toledo. And she wrote a paper, like 100 pages long, report of the 1922 ecology trip, and she only got a B+. He was a hard grader. And she was interested in the botany. So because it was an ecology trip, it wasn't just a birding and ornithology trip. The first journal just happened to be a student who was interested in the birds and kept accounts of the birds. But Grace was interested in the botany and the type of habitat, so she kept this very detailed map. They drove out and back in different directions. They stopped in Utah, where Lynds' brother Marcus lived, and he was a rather noted botanist at the time. And they picked Marcus up, and they took him on the rest of the trip, as far as I can tell. They went to Pasadena again to visit brother and sister, also to pick up lots of birds in LA County. But as you can imagine, with cars come a lot of car trouble, especially back then. I think they had multiple flat tires a day, so they were constantly stopping and changing tires. The early Fords had a flaw in almost all of them. They had a very weak timing spring. But George, Lynds' son, learned very early on that was what, the car stopped running. The first thing you do is you check the timing spring. And so he basically had a pocket full of replacements that were a stronger gauge than the ones that actually first came with the car. So they're fixing punctures, running out of gas, fording rivers. Here they're replacing a connecting rod. In the 1921 trip, George wrote about seeing tire tracks go off the side of the road in the mountains and realizing that it was Lynds and his car that had driven off the side of the road because the steering mechanism had become uncoupled and he wasn't able to navigate the turn. Luckily, George was observant and saw the tire tracks and wondered what happened. And they were able to pull the car up, nobody was hurt. They fixed the car. It took a couple days because they had to have parts shipped from the West Coast, but they got back on the road. And that was one of the cars they weren't able to sell. And looking at these pictures, I was struck by how similar or identical the scenery is. I've been to the Badlands and Cedar Breaks, and it looks pretty much exactly the same, except I took color pictures. But the people are so different, at least in how they were dressed. So here's Greta, another woman on the trip. Gladys, Greta, Grace, Louise, Genevieve, and then George and Lynds Jones. And then there's another man named Joel, and then Homer. But as I think all the trips had a lot of women on them. And it wasn't just students, they were community women as well. They were friends and relatives they picked up on the way. Everyone paid a certain amount toward the trip, toward food and the cost of cars. They had a little fun too. They dressed up in seaweed and played with pelicans, maybe a little more than they should have. This is the only photograph that actually had of Grace herself because somebody else took that picture. And that's the end of my story about the travels. And I'm going to turn now to his personal legacy. He had 5 children. The oldest was Lynds Leo, then Theodore Burton, George Tallman, who I've already spoken of quite a bit, Beth, and then Harold Charles. Lynds became an electrician and lived in Louisiana, and he and his father both died within a year of each other in 1951, 1952, as did George's son Lynds. So all 3 Lynds Jones died within a year. Theo, unfortunately, died at age 13 in a farming accident. George, on the other hand, lived to be over 100 years old.
103 months.
103 months. And 2 of George's granddaughters are here today. They Renata and Johanna drove all the way from Massachusetts just to come tonight, and they're going to drive home tomorrow.
That's right.
Thank you.
So I'm really, really pleased that they're here.
We've been to Oberlin.
George went to Oberlin College, and he also got his PhD at the University of Chicago, and he was a botanist for his career. He had some really interesting, peculiar differences from his father. So his father founded a journal he published constantly. George never published a paper in his entire life.
Oh my goodness.
But he collected botanical specimens obsessively, and he also collected documents, and he wrote prodigiously typewritten pages, accounts of everything. He wrote a 700 or 800 page biography of his father, of Lynds. It's a day-by-day account. It's not even broken up by year. It's like he moved the manure piles, and he met with Althea Sherman. So I'm trying to work my way through it to discover the wheat and leave behind the chaff, but it's a slog. And he also wrote a 4,000-page autobiography, which if you were to publish it,
He called it his memoirs.
his memoirs, memoirs. If you were to publish that, it would be a 20-volume set. It's an incredible amount of words. He was a character. He lived in Oberlin his entire life and led weekly ecology walks every Sunday afternoon, and many people in town still remember those because he lived until 1998. Unfortunately, I didn't move to Oberlin until 2004, so I never met him, but I certainly heard a lot about him. Beth married one of Lynds' students who had gone on a summer ecology field trip, Max de Labenfels, and he became a marine biologist and a world-renowned spongiologist. And one of their sons became an expert in the taxonomy of conifers. So they took deep dives into natural history, this whole family. And Harold Charles became a biology professor in Georgia, and that's the college where Lynds donated his egg collection, Berry College. I give my thanks to the resources that I found online, particularly an article written by Mrs. H.J. Taylor, I think her name is Helen, in the Wilson Bulletin. It wasn't a eulogy, but he's still alive. I think it was when he retired. She wrote about his contributions to ornithology. And then Rick Wright published this blog post in 2015, the most influential birder most of us have never heard of. And I started there with a lot of the material that I'm speaking about today, all of the birding practices, the big day, the big year, Christmas bird count, all came from that. And then I just supplemented with what I discovered in the archives. The Jones family papers, Enid Bancroft Sutton papers, Grace Cowling Berlin papers, the Oberlin Heritage Center for actually commissioning me to talk about this a few years ago, and Renata Green, who's been sending me a lot of material as well. Any questions?
Is there been published a collection of his, let's say, best articles in ornithology?
There isn't a collection, but it's easy to find online. So if you go, there's many collections of these digitized journals, and you can search on his name. But he also was the editor, and not all of the editor's notes are credited to him or searchable by Lynds Jones. But all of his published papers you can access that way.
So just Google Lynds Jones's papers.
Lines.
Lynds Jones, ornithology.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Becky.
Why don't you write a book?
Well, that was my original goal. But that got subverted many times, so I may still do that. But and I did start, but I haven't finished it.
It's a great story.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
How did some of the things you pioneered translate into popular birding, like Christmas walks, like the keeping lists and so on? How did those?
Well, all of this started out as ornithology, so he didn't set out to do foundational birding practices. They just caught on in popular culture, and birding and ornithology were not different in the early 20th century. It's only later that they diverged, and those of us who think of ourselves as birders aren't obsessed with taxonomy. And ornithologists do study other things other than taxonomy now, but they're much more scientific in their studies, and I think the birding stuff, the stuff that was easier for lay people to do, caught on, and of course the hobby of birding just keeps growing and growing. Anyone else? Yeah.
Is banding more the ornithology side or the birding side, or just sort of in the middle?
Banding is definitely an ornithological practice. It's often made available to birders to come and observe, but you can't have a banding permit or conduct a banding survey without having a scientific purpose behind it. Yes?
How did you personally get started in birding, and at what age?
How did I get started in birding? I grew up on the East Coast. And I guess my spark bird, I would say, is a great blue heron because I just loved watching them fly. But I didn't really look at birds that much until I moved to Chicago in my late 20s. And I was trying to meet people, and I saw this poster that said, "Bird with chicks." And I thought, well, that's really clever. I bet I'll meet some interesting people if I go at 5:30 in the morning to Montrose Beach. So I did that, and I don't remember any of the people I met, but I saw warblers for the first time, and it just kind of exploded my brain that these could be in downtown Chicago, and I have never stopped being obsessed with warblers.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking. Yeah.
Were his publications most of an observational nature, or did he ever publish papers where he would use statistics to evaluate data?
He did long-range observational studies that he kind of analyzed. For example, he had 50 years of data of bird migration in Lorraine County, and he kept track of 150 species every year, mostly. It wasn't just him, but his students, and first arrival dates for 50 years. And actually, I had, at one point, wanted my daughter to do a project where she compared modern eBird data with Lynds Jones historical data to see if those spring arrival dates had shifted over those intervening years. But he also published things like first bird for Lorraine County. He observed the first Carolina wren, published a paper on it, which kind of ironically, or maybe serendipitously, the day before I decided I was going to do my first dive into the archives, I found a new bird for Lorraine County. I found a roseate spoonbill. So I was all these parallels still kind of blow my mind. Anyone else?
Wow.
Spoonbill in Lorraine County.
Yes, yes.
Wow.
In 2018, June 13th or 14th? Yeah.
Wow.
And I have to say, I wasn't actually the first person to observe it, because it was observed at Kendall and Oberlin by a resident there at the retirement home who's walking her dog, and she took a picture of this funny-looking pink heron, but she waited 5 days to show it to anybody. She knew her housekeeper was a birder, so she took the picture and she said, Maureen, what is this bird? It's pink. And Maureen was like, oh my God, that's a roseate spoon. And so she put out the bird, and I knew exactly where the picture was taken. And so I started looking at like, every birder in Lorraine County, basically,
Oh, sure.
spread out throughout the county to try to re-find this bird. And at dusk on that day, I just happened to be driving by a wetland. It was like the last place I could possibly look before it got dark. I didn't even have my binoculars, and I saw this bird. That is not an egret. That is not shaped quite like an egret. I think it might be the spoonbill, but I raced home, broke this bead limit, grabbed my binoculars. I didn't have a camera, so I did a digibin photograph, and I sent it out, and it sure enough was roseate spoonbill.
Wow. Wow.
Do they figure it just got blown around?
Well, when they fledged, they sometimes disperse quite a long distance, and I think there was a hurricane or some big weather event, and it came up to Ohio, and I think that bird wandered around the state for the rest of the summer because it kept being seen, and we never sure that it was the same bird, but I don't think it was ever documented in two places at the same time. Kind of took a tour of the state. It only was in Oberlin for 2 days.
Wow. Wow.
I'm going to leave you with one final slide. Renata sent me this photograph of the last car owned by Lynds Jones, which I think the previous slide, this is his 54th car. This was not his 55th because there were more cars in between, but this is his 1946 Ford that George took a photograph of in 1964, still sitting outside the house. And I'm giving some upcoming talks next week at Firelands Audubon, in the fall at Presque Isle Audubon in Pennsylvania, and in February at Oberlin College. And I'm looking for more speaking opportunities, so if you know anyone who's interested, please get in touch.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your interest.